You were never management material, Marcus. You were barely line material. Vanessa Cole said it lightly, the way a person flicks lint off a jacket, and the 12 people in the room went very quiet. Marcus Doyle stood with his hands folded in front of him, a folder of his own on the table that no one had asked to see. 9 weeks from that morning, Vanessa Cole would stand in a bakery 3 miles from the plant she owned, holding a cinnamon roll she did not yet know was about to unmake everything she believed about herself. Stay with me to the end, I promise you the ending is worth it. If you like stories where quiet people win the long way, hit subscribe before we start, because Velvet Storiez Tales has more of these waiting for you. Marcus Doyle had spent 14 years learning that flour does not lie. Sugar either creams properly or it doesn't. Dough either proofs on schedule or it collapses, and no amount of talking will change what the oven decides to do at 400 degrees. He liked that about baking. It was the one part of his life that answered honestly. He worked the overnight quality line at Holbrook Baking Company, a regional supplier that shipped bread and pastry to grocery chains across 3 states. His job was simple in description and relentless in practice: walk the line, check the batches, reject anything that didn't meet spec, and put his signature on a form that said the food leaving the building that night was safe. He had done it since he was 22. He was 36 now, and the only thing that had changed in 14 years was how tired his knees got standing on concrete for 10 hours a night. He raised his daughter, Ivy, alone. Her mother had left when Ivy was 2, and Marcus had never once made his daughter feel the shape of that absence, which took more effort than anyone watching him drop her at school at 7:10 every morning would ever guess. Ivy was 9 now, sharp in the particular way of children who spend a lot of time with adults instead of other children, and she asked Marcus questions that landed harder than she meant them to. "Do you like your job?" she'd asked him once, over cereal, in the flat morning light. "I like that it's honest," he told her, which was the truest answer he had, and also not quite an answer at all. He had wanted, once, to have his own place. Not a factory line. A real counter, real ovens, his name over the door. He had told exactly one person that dream in his whole life, Walter Cole, the man who'd founded Holbrook 40 years earlier and still walked the floor twice a week until cancer made walking hard and then made it impossible. Walter used to stop by Marcus's station and taste whatever came off first, and once, only once, late on a slow Tuesday night, Marcus had told him about the bakery he pictured owning someday. Walter hadn't laughed. He'd nodded slowly and said, "Some men are line workers their whole lives because nobody ever asked them what they were capable of." Marcus never forgot that sentence. He didn't know yet that Walter hadn't forgotten it either. Walter died 8 months before this story starts. His daughter, Vanessa Cole, inherited the company at 31, several years earlier than she or anyone else had expected, and she inherited it the way a person inherits a house fire, mid-collapse, with no time to learn where anything was kept. She had an MBA and a spreadsheet mind and almost no time to grieve before 300 employees started looking to her for answers. She covered the not knowing with certainty, because certainty was easier to project than confusion, and she was, in the way of people freshly promoted past their comfort, harder on the people below her than the situation required. The man who made that harshness easy for her to aim was Russell Pike, Holbrook's chief operating officer, who had worked beside Walter for 11 years and had spent most of those years quietly resenting that the company would never be his. Pike was polished in every room that mattered and careless in every room that didn't, and 3 months before Walter's death, an inspection had flagged a moisture problem in one of the flour silos, the kind of contamination that, left unaddressed, meant recalled product, lawsuits, and a public disaster Pike could not survive with his reputation intact. Pike had quietly rerouted the flagged flour into a secondary product line instead of destroying it, and he had made sure the paper trail for that decision led anywhere but to him. It led, eventually, to Marcus. The night the batch went out wrong, Marcus was the one who caught it. He held a handful of pastry dough that smelled faintly, wrongly sour, and he did what he always did: he pulled the whole batch, wrote it up, and walked it up the chain, because that was the job. What he didn't know was that the paperwork Pike had already filed made it look like Marcus had approved the compromised flour for use 2 shifts earlier, then caught his own mistake too late to avoid a partial shipment reaching stores. It was a lie built entirely out of true dates and false signatures, and it was good enough to survive one afternoon of scrutiny from a CEO who had been in the job for 6 weeks and desperately needed to look decisive. Vanessa called the meeting for 9 a.m. She had the folder Pike had prepared sitting closed in front of her because she had already decided, before Marcus walked in, what it contained. "You had contaminated product in the building for 2 shifts before it was caught," she said. "Under your signature." Marcus said, evenly, that he had pulled the batch the moment he found it, that he had never signed off on it earlier, that the dates in the file didn't match his own logs. He asked to see the surveillance timestamps from the silo room, the ones that would show he'd never been near that flower until the night he flagged it. "We don't have time to relitigate every shift for the last 2 weeks, Vanessa said. She did not look at Pike, who was standing by the window with his arms crossed, saying nothing, which was its own kind of testimony that nobody in the room was equipped to read yet. "You were never management material, Marcus. You were barely line material." He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, without a flinch anyone could point to. He asked once more, quietly, if anyone would look at the actual footage. Vanessa told him that Holbrook needed people who didn't require a defense every time something went wrong, and she thanked him for his years of service in a tone she might have used to end a phone call with a wrong number. He drove home at 9:40 in the morning, an hour he had never once seen the inside of his own kitchen in 14 years of night shifts, and he sat at the table where Ivy usually ate her cereal, and he did the arithmetic. Severance would cover 6 weeks. His savings, built one careful paycheck at a time, would cover perhaps 4 more. After that, there was nothing but the small, dangerous idea he had never said out loud to anyone but a dying man 2 years earlier. Dolores Vance found him in the parking lot before he left that day. Dolores had run HR at Holbrook since before Vanessa was born, and she had a way of knowing things that never made it into any file. She didn't say much. She told him to keep his old logbooks, the paper ones he still kept out of habit even though the company had gone digital years back. "Just in case anybody ever wants the truth instead of the story," she said, and then she went back inside before he could ask her what she meant. He didn't understand it yet. He would. He found the building on Larch Street 11 days later, driving nowhere in particular the way a person drives when staying still has become unbearable. It had been a bakery once, empty for 2 years, the windows soaped over, a "for sale" sign fading in the door. He stood on the sidewalk and let the old idea unfold for the first time since Walter Cole had told him some men are never asked what they're capable of. Buying it with the last of his savings was not a plan. It was closer to a leap made by a man who had run out of other directions to walk in. He signed the papers anyway. He told Ivy that night, expecting to have to explain failure to a 9-year-old. Instead she looked up from her homework and said, "So now nobody gets to tell you you're not good enough at it," which was, Marcus realized, the single clearest sentence anyone had said to him in months. The first 6 weeks nearly broke him. The proofing room held no heat. One of the 2 ovens ran 40 degrees hot no matter what he did to the dial. He fixed what he could with his own hands at 2 in the morning because he could no longer afford to pay anyone else to. He was at the counter by 4, baking until noon, cleaning until evening, and home in time to help Ivy with fractions before falling asleep at the kitchen table more nights than he'd admit. Word in town had already decided who Marcus Doyle was, the man Holbrook fired over a contamination scandal, and word does not update itself for anyone's convenience. There were mornings he sold 6 items. There were afternoons when the only sound in the shop was the tick of the cooling rack. What saved him was the same thing that had always been the one honest part of his life. He stopped chasing what was merely good and insisted, the way he'd insisted on a factory floor for 14 years, on what was exactly right. He learned the flour by feel. He learned the minute a laminated dough wanted to leave the proofer and the minute it didn't. The first customers who wandered in expecting to confirm what the town already believed found a croissant that shattered the correct way, and they came back, and they brought someone else. By the second month, the little shop, he'd named it Larch and Doyle, because Ivy had insisted his own name belonged on the glass, was drawing a small, steady line most mornings. It wasn't a triumph. It was survival with the outline of a future in it, which for a man in Marcus's position was very close to the same thing as hope. Vanessa Cole walked in on an ordinary Tuesday, on one of the site visits she still made personally because she trusted no one else's read on a neighborhood. She didn't recognize the shop or the man behind the counter until he looked up, and her expression changed from idle assessment to something colder. "You were never management material," she said, not unkindly exactly, just certain, "and now I suppose you found the next size down." She said it was almost fitting, a man who couldn't hold a line job landing behind a counter instead. Marcus didn't correct her. The urge was there, to tell her the lease had his name on it, that the role she was holding was his own recipe, that the line behind her had come for something he'd made and not a paycheck someone handed him. He let the urge pass. He'd spent 14 years being defined by other people's conclusions, and he'd learned in the last 2 months that arguing with a conclusion only fed it. He rang her up, thanked her, and said nothing else. She left certain she'd witnessed the bottom of his story. She was wrong, and the truth was already coming for her from 2 directions at once. The first direction arrived by mail 11 days later, in the form of a letter from Walter Cole's estate attorney. Walter had left a sealed addendum to his trust, to be opened only if Holbrook's ownership changed hands and only if, in the trustee's judgment, the values I built this company on had been abandoned. Pike's cover-up, and Marcus's firing under it, had triggered exactly that clause, because Dolores Vance, quietly, deliberately, over 11 days, had sent the trustee copies of Marcus's paper logbooks, the ones that proved his timestamps didn't match the file Pike had built. The addendum named Marcus directly. Walter had written, in his own hand, that he had watched a young quality inspector turn down easier paths for a decade in favor of the harder, honest one, and that if Holbrook ever needed reminding what integrity looked like on the floor, it should look for Marcus Doyle before it looked anywhere else. It wasn't a fortune. It was a clause guaranteeing Marcus a formal review and reinstatement hearing should he ever be terminated without cause, a protection Walter had quietly built in years earlier and never told a soul about, least of all Marcus. Vanessa read it in her father's old office, and for the first time since his death, she cried where no one could see her. The second direction arrived the following week, when the State Agriculture Board, following up on an unrelated routine audit, requested Holbrook's silo maintenance records for the quarter of the contamination. Pike had falsified those too, and falsifying them twice, under 2 different pressures, is exactly the kind of thing that eventually produces a paper trail even a careless man can't fully erase. Vanessa, newly alert to what she hadn't been looking for, pulled the surveillance logs herself this time, the ones nobody had bothered to check in the 9 o'clock meeting 9 weeks earlier. They showed exactly what Marcus had asked her to look at and she had refused to, Pike alone in the silo room, 2 full days before the batch Marcus flagged and pulled at his own initiative. She drove to Larch Street on a Wednesday morning, before the line formed. She stood across the street longer than she'd admit before crossing. The bell rang over her the way it now rang over everyone. Marcus looked up and knew her, and whatever he felt didn't show, because he'd had a great deal of practice not showing it. She didn't lead with an excuse. She said his name, and then she told him what the estate addendum said, and what the silo footage showed, and that Russell Pike would be removed from the company within the week and the board notified of everything he'd falsified. "I said you were never management material," she told him. "I said it standing in a room where I never once asked to see the footage that would have proven you right in under 10 minutes. I'm sorry for how I fired you, and I'm sorry for what I decided about you before I ever really looked." Marcus let the apology land before answering it. "I don't need the ending to make the firing make sense," he said. "It nearly cost me everything before it cost me nothing. Don't tell yourself losing that job did me a favor. It didn't. What did this?" He gestured at the shop, at the ovens, at the life he'd built one sleepless night at a time, was refusing to stop after the door closed. "That part's mine." She took that quietly, without defending herself, which was, for Vanessa Cole, a kind of change no one at Holbrook would have believed possible a season earlier. The formal hearing happened 3 weeks later, in the same boardroom where Marcus had once asked to see footage no one would pull up. This time the footage was already on the screen when he walked in. Pike was not in the room. He had been terminated and referred to the state board days earlier, his 11 years at Holbrook ending in a folder of his own falsified signatures. The board reinstated Marcus's record, cleared his name publicly, and, per Walter's addendum, offered him a position overseeing quality standards across the whole company, a role with his name on the door in a way the old line job never had been. Marcus turned it down. Gently, but completely. "I already have a shop with my name on the glass," he said. "I spent 14 years wanting that more than I wanted a title. I'm not trading it back." Vanessa didn't argue. She asked instead if Holbrook could source its retail flour line from Larch and Doyle's recipes, under his name, on his terms. It was, she admitted, as much an excuse to keep him near the company as it was a business decision, though she didn't say that part out loud yet. Marcus said he'd think about it, which both of them understood to mean yes, eventually, once trust had caught up to the offer. She came back to the shop more than the arrangement required. She sat at the small counter by the window on slow afternoons and let Ivy explain, at length and with great authority, the correct way to laminate dough. Vanessa listened to a 9-year-old the way she had once failed to listen to a grown man standing in her boardroom, and something about the correction stayed with her. It was Ivy, in the end, who said the thing neither adult had worked up the nerve to say. "You should just come here more," she told Vanessa one evening, without looking up from her drawing, "because Dad smiles different when you're here than when you're not." Neither of them denied it. The romance that followed built the way real things build after two people have already seen each other at their worst, slowly, without performance, over shared coffee and shop-closing routines and 100 small honesties that had nothing left to prove. Marcus, who had spent his whole working life learning the difference between what looked right and what was right, found that the same instinct applied here too. This felt like the second kind. Months later, on a slow Sunday, Ivy taped a new drawing to the shop's front window, 2 ovens, a small figure with flour on her hands, and 3 people standing together under a sign that read Larch and Doyle in her own careful crayon lettering. Marcus stood looking at it with Vanessa beside him, the bell over the door ringing behind an ordinary morning customer, and he thought, not for the first time, that the door Holbrook had closed on him had only ever been in the way of the one that was always meant to be his. Neither of them had been looking for this. Both of them, in the end, were glad they'd found it anyway. If this one got you, there are more waiting for you at Velvet Storiez Tales. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.